Today we want to look at the attempts at reform of the Roman Empire. It's deteriorating over several centuries, but there were some attempts by a couple of emperors to stop the deterioration, to stop the fall. And we're going to look at what those were. First of all, under Diocletian, who was proclaimed emperor by the army in 284, he did a couple of things. First of all, he reshaped the political structure of the empire. He did this by, first of all, choosing a co-emperor, which he called an Augustus. Now, it's kind of confusing because he uses terms that we have had before, but he's using them in a different way. So he chose a co-emperor to rule the western half of the empire while he ruled in the east. So Diocletian is going to rule over in the east part of the empire, and then another person whom he's calling an Augustus is ruling in the west. Then, in addition to that, each co-emperor was to appoint an assistant called a Caesar to help the Augustus and then to become his successor. So, he's ruling in the east, he has a Caesar under him. Somebody else is ruling in the west, he has a Caesar under him, so that when each of them dies, then the Caesar becomes the next Augustus. Follow? So, remember, up until this point, there has been no plan for what happens when an emperor dies. So he's coming up with a plan. Dividing the empire gives more hands-on to at least half of the empire, half of the world, and then having someone in training to take over when that person dies seems like a good idea. So because of this, then the empire was divided into four large administrative divisions called prefectures, to be ruled by the two co-emperors and the two Caesars. So even though the Augustuses, the co-emperors, were over the Caesars, they each had a fourth of the empire over which to rule, divided into four sections. All right, do you follow? Everybody understand what's going on? All right, now these measures brought temporary stability. It seemed to help for a while. The next thing he did, that's the political issue. Remember, we saw that was one of the things that helped to bring about the demise of the Roman Empire. So he's addressing the political issue. Next, he addresses the economic issue. He introduced some strong measures to combat Rome's economic problems. The first thing he did was to set maximum prices on goods and services in order to curb inflation. We call this price controls. So he said, here are limits of what you can sell, any of the goods that you're selling. Any people who are selling items in stores or they're making items to sell, he told them what the highest price they could charge was. And he made sure that they followed it because the penalty was pretty stiff. If you sold an item above the price limit, you actually could be put to death. Well, I know that candy bar was supposed to be 25 cents and I sold it for 30 cents. Is that really worth being dying for? I don't know. So I'm sure it wasn't that simple. All right, so price controls. Now, let's get an economics lesson here real quickly, because that's been tried in this country too. Several times, FDR had price controls. Richard Nixon set wage and price controls when he was president because of high inflation. And it's a way to keep inflation, keep prices from going up. It sounds like it makes sense. But to keep prices from going up, we'll just limit how much people can charge. That'll keep prices from going up, right? Does that sound like that would be a good idea? You're very non-committal. Does it sound like that would be a good idea? I'm not saying would it be a good idea. Does that sound good? Does that sound like people would say, yeah, that's good. Stop the prices. I don't want to, I'm tired of paying more money for stuff all the time. Set a limit on the prices.
Yes.
Sounds like that would be good. Now, why doesn't it work? If you are selling something, if you're making something and selling it, let's say you're making chairs. You know, you're buying wood from somebody, you're buying other parts maybe that you need to make a chair, and so you're making chairs. You know, you buy the paint or varnish, whatever, to work on the chair. And then you sell the chair, and you're told that there's a price limit. You can't sell the chair for more than what the price that's been set by the government. All right, let's say you know, it's harder to find good wood, so maybe you have to pay a little more for the wood more than you were before. Maybe the person was charging less than what is the price that was set, and somehow your expenses are going up, and so you want to raise the price of your chair, but you're not allowed to. So what can you do? In order to make more money on your chairs, what can you do if you can't make the price higher? How are you going to make more money by selling it for less? Now, it might work if you're able to sell higher volume, but if your expenses are such that selling a higher volume doesn't help you any, then that wouldn't help either. All right, so Zach has a good idea. What?
Make them cheaper.
Make them out of cheaper materials.
Yes.
So would that work? Would you get more money if you're selling it at the price you're allowed, but you're using cheaper materials? Are you going to gain income from that? Yeah, you're going to have a higher profit, right, by using cheaper materials. Now, what effect does that have on the people buying the chairs? What, John? Take your hand away from your mouth.
They don't get as good as quality.
Yeah, they don't get as good a quality. They don't get as good a chair as they once had. Now, if you don't have price controls, and the person making the chairs says, "I've got to raise the prices," then the person buying the chair has a choice. I'm either going to buy the chair at a higher price, or I'm going to get a cheaper chair that's less, you know, less. What was the word you used? I can't think of it now. It's a cheaper material, and not as good a standard, not a higher standard, but at least I know. At least I know what I'm getting. So, price controls don't work. I'll give you an example, a real example of what happened in this country. An example you can identify with. How many of you have ever bought a candy bar? All right. Now, this is kind of irrelevant, but when I was a kid, those candy bars you pay $1 for now
20 cents.
were a nickel. I beat you. It's a nickel. I remember have you ever had a Mars bar with almonds? When they came out with that, they charged 6 cents because they had almonds in it. It was a big deal. All right. So what happened during price controls? It happened with candy bars. It happened with detergent. It happened with almost any product that was in a container, and it continues to happen even now. If you've got a candy bar, and for, you know, let's say it's that long, candy bar, maybe it's a little longer than that, but that's where my hand goes. Okay, so you got a candy bar that's that long, and you're not allowed to raise the price, but you need to make more money. So what do? I can't raise the price, so what do?
Lose quality.
So I can use cheaper products in it,
Yes.
so maybe it doesn't taste as good.
Yes.
What's something else I can do?
Change it.
Matthew?
Make the size smaller.
Make it smaller. Make it a little bit smaller so that hardly anybody notices, but over selling a whole bunch of them, I'm actually making money. And this, you've seen it happen. If you ever go to the grocery store, you know that this happens. You buy a bag of chips that you pay so much for, and suddenly you realize that the bag is the same size, but there seem to be less chips in it than there used to be. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Same thing with detergent. You buy a box of detergent, and it's the same size, but there's less detergent than there used to be. That's a result. That is inflation. Even though the price hasn't gone up, it's still inflation because the product has gone down. You follow? And that's what price controls do. It creates a situation where people basically are cheating in order to get more money. All right, so that's one thing he did. He tried to initiate price controls, and in an economy that does not work. Next, he tried to introduce confidence in the monetary system by putting out new gold and silver coins. Now, these weren't just regular gold and silver coins. He had debased them. He had made them smaller. So it'd be the equivalent of you saying, you know, okay, I've got a silver dollar here, and it's worth $1. But if the government actually made it smaller than the silver dollar, so it really wasn't $1's worth of silver, you might think that it's still worth $1, but in reality, it doesn't have $1's worth of silver. And so the coins are smaller. What does that do then? Once people figure that out, you know, back then you got people that are weighing, hey, that silver doesn't weigh as much as it's supposed to. So what happens? If people recognize that the coins are now have less silver in them than they used to,
They'll make more things expensive.
it'll cause the prices to go up. Right. That's inflation. That means people are paying higher prices. Did anybody gain anything by making the silver dollars smaller, let's say, and making prices go up? Did anybody gain from that?
No.
Actually, there's one entity that gained, the government. Because the government, and this is how it works, and this is how it happens in our country, inflation is good for government. Because inflation means that all the money the government borrowed last year, now, if they repay that same amount of dollars, they're paying it with dollars that are worth less than what they were, so they're actually repaying a loan with less money. It's the same dollar amount, but it's actually worth less money because of inflation. I don't know if you follow that or not, but that's an economics lesson for you that we can learn what not to do from Diocletian. It did not restore confidence because he put out a lot more coins, because the coins were worth less than what the previous coins were. All right, he also reformed the tax system somewhat. He had increased the taxes in order to fund the wars begun under Marcus Aurelius, and so he decreased what had been increased. So, you know, it felt good to have them go down, but they had been increased before that anyway. So oftentimes in this country, we're happy if we get a tax break if taxes go down. But in reality, they've gone up a lot in the past, so even going down doesn't take it where it should be. The requisitions and forced labor to which the emperors of the 3rd century had resorted in order to save the state were transformed into a lasting system. So temporarily, they used slave labor, and they forced people to work on projects. That was supposed to be a temporary situation, but it became permanent. Peasants were gradually deprived of their personal freedom and had to remain on the soil, on that land. They weren't allowed to leave. The artisan corporations, groups of people that made things, even the higher civil servants were organized as hereditary castes. In other words, if you were the son of a tinker, then you were a tinker. If you were the son of someone in government, then you would work in government. And then there was a crushing burden of taxation imposed on them. Diocletian's measures involved greater government control and regulations, which only added to the problems that they were intended to solve. Take this as a principle as well. Whenever government tries to solve problems that they created, it only makes it worse. And then they come up with new solutions to the problems that they've created, and that only makes it worse. We see this going on and on for many, many years in our country. When government thinks that they are a solution to the problem, in reality, they are the cause of the problem. Keep that in mind as you get old enough to vote. Anybody says the government is a solution, say, not according to what we learned about Diocletian. And then you'll confuse everybody because they've never heard of it. All right. So Diocletian tried to solve the problems with government control and was not able to do so. Any questions about what Diocletian did, both politically and economically? Okay, we come a little bit later to Constantine. Constantine was involved in a civil war. When Diocletian retired in 305, his system of joint rule, co-emperors, fell apart. And civil war broke out between the co-emperors and the Caesars. Constantine emerged victorious, as we have learned before, and became sole ruler of the empire. Now, as far as reform, he continued many of the same things that Diocletian had done. He reorganized the entire system of local government into prefectures, dioceses, and provinces. So he divided up the empire into very small pieces and had people in charge of each of those. And that was an attempt to put government at a more local level. He moved the capital of the empire to the east, to the city that he built and named after himself, Constantinople. And that only served to weaken the already struggling western half of the empire. It was the western half of the empire that had to deal with the barbarian invasions and all of that. And so him moving the capital just further weakened the Western Empire. So Constantine's efforts at reform were not enough to halt the slide of the empire into impotence, into no power. So, preparation for division. Diocletian and Constantine prepared the way for the ultimate division of the Roman Empire into two separate empires. They both had tried to rule it with co-rulers and so on, and that didn't work. So eventually what happened is the empire became permanently divided in 395 when Emperor Theodosius I divided it between his two sons. So rather than having one son take over the entire empire, he divided it in two, and it remained divided. There's now the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. Then we come back to what we discussed before, the barbarian invasions of the empire. In the West, growing numbers of Germanic peoples moved down from Northern Europe, settling along Rome's borders. So they're coming down from this direction. They were called barbarians by the Romans. And they consisted of independent tribes of Angles, Saxons, Franks, Vandals, and Goths, all of which we have talked about before. So we're just kind of reviewing here. These are the tribes that are invading from the north, coming into the Roman Empire. Well, Rome found it difficult to recruit enough soldiers to maintain security along the border. Some emperors allowed the most Romanized of the Germanic tribes to settle within Roman territory as a buffer. So they said, okay, you guys can settle in here, and you just keep out the other ones. You know, you're kind of like us. You've adopted some of our customs, so we'll let you live here. You keep the other guys out. Other emperors allowed barbarians to actually enlist in the army, and they became the primary means of protecting the empire against the more restless tribes outside her borders. So now Rome is actually using barbarians in the Roman army to keep out other barbarians. In the east, we have the menace of, oops, oh, there was that last point, sorry, I didn't get that up there. Everybody have that? In the east, we have the menace of the Huns. In the late 4th century, out of the Far East, came a fierce nomadic tribe called the Huns. They prompted many Germanic tribes to seek refuge in Roman territory. So as the Huns are expanding this direction, it caused a lot of German tribes that are living here to come into Roman territory to escape the Huns. So that's part of the pressure that Rome is feeling from the Germanic tribes of the north, is because of what's happening over here in the east. Then we have the rebellion of the Visigoths. Get that point down if you didn't get that. The rebellion of the Visigoths took place this way. Emperor Valens led the Roman army against the Visigoths at the Battle of Adrianople, where he was killed and the army was soundly defeated. The Visigoths then crossed the Danube River, settling in the Eastern Roman Empire to escape the Huns. Following their chieftain Alaric, they began their incursion into Roman territory during the winter of AD 406, when the Danube River finally froze solid enough to allow thousands of hungry warriors to cross, seeking grain and gold. See, they're experiencing pressure from the Huns, and they're up against the river. They can't get across the river. But it got cold enough for the river to freeze, and so they were able to cross over the river when it was solid and escape the Huns, but in so doing, come into Roman territory. But they were mistreated by Roman officials, and so they rebelled. Nearly 250,000 Visigoths crossed into Roman territory, beginning migrations within the empire. And we saw before how the Visigoths spread. The Visigoths then, led by Alaric, moved southwestward into the Italian peninsula and plundered the city of Rome in 410. They had besieged it on 2 previous occasions and were bought off by bribes from wealthy Roman senators. But when they besieged the city in 410, the citizens of Rome were near starvation, and they had very little to give. They tried to bluff Alaric by telling him that thousands of Romans would arise to resist them if he invaded. Yeah, they're hiding. You can't see them now, but there are thousands that will rise up if you invade Rome. Alaric replied, "The thicker the hay, the more easily it is mowed down," and demanded everything they owned: gold, silver, temple ornaments, and slaves. The negotiators wished to know, "And what will you leave us?" "Your lives," Alaric responded. Tough guy. Then on the fateful night of August 24th, someone inside the city opened one of the 12 recently reinforced gates, and Alaric's army flooded into the streets of Rome. For 3 days, they plundered, pillaged, and terrorized the city. Survivors told of carts filled with corpses, dogs barking and roaming free through the temple precincts, men hunted down and murdered into public baths, priests assaulted, virgins raped, and one aged woman, Marcella, brutally beaten because she had no gold. The Visigoths moved on from here eventually and founded a kingdom in Spain. These events led to the writing of City of God by St. Augustine of Hippo. It caused Augustine to think about the meaning of history. Now, how is it that Rome, that mighty empire, could have fallen so badly? He thought about the reality of time. and the calling of Jesus' followers to live with hope amidst tottering empires that come and go. And that's the theme of the City of God. Well, there are others that invade. The Teutonic Lombards, Burgundians, and Franks crossed the Rhine River, settling in northern Gaul, up in here. Angles and Saxons crossed over into Britain. The Huns, led by their fierce leader Attila, who they nicknamed the Scourge of God, for he was considered to be the instrument of God's wrath upon a sinful people, invaded Europe. The Huns were finally driven back by a joint effort of Romans and Germans at Chalons. The Vandals raided and pillaged Rome in 455, led by a thug named Genseric. And this was even more devastating than that of the Visigoths. The Vandals then settled in North Africa. Down here. The collapse then of Rome. With the onslaught of the barbarian invasions, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. In 476, the army ended the long period of Roman rule by placing a non-Roman upon the emperor's throne in the West. In that year, another hairy barbarian warlord, Odovacer, deposed the beardless boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, and Rome joined the company of Nineveh and other fallen empires. And the Roman Empire was no more. Any questions? Tomorrow we're going to have an open note test over the whole period from the apologists up through the fall of Rome. There are enough questions that if you don't know anything, you won't have time to find it on your notes. So you need to do a little review of what's in your notes. I would suggest, if you haven't already, going through and highlighting the important people so you can find them easily. So tomorrow when you're taking the test, you can go through your notes quickly and find what you need to. It's helpful to know some things you can put down without looking at your notes. And I would suggest maybe going through the test as you take it tomorrow and doing that first, and then go back and look in your notes at other things, and then when you have time, go back and check the things that you thought you knew. All right, so the time we have left, we have about 4 minutes. Start looking through your notes, get those organized for a test tomorrow. Any questions? From the apologists up through the fall of Rome.